usually get up about 6 a.m. and read everything I can until about 8. First of all, I read an electronic newspaper. I would like to read a physical newspaper, but they don't deliver here, and I don't own a car, so I have no way to get to a physical newspaper. So I read 3 newspapers every day, and I read all of the publications in electronic form for the printing industry. I watch everything I can. So I try to stay informed about what's happening in the world and what's happening in my world. My whole life revolves around what I do here. I write about the industry. I write for other publications. I write the newsletter. I'm involved in every aspect of it. So really, there's no other aspect of my life at this stage of the game. I do enjoy theater. Every now and then I will go to New York City by train and do as many Broadway shows as I can. I've collected several hundred CDs of Broadway shows. I like Gilbert and Sullivan. I write song parodies. When I ran the Quark Users Group many years ago, I did a show called My Fair Quark. And I had people sing songs that I had written. So that's really peripheral to what I do. Everything is really directed at trying to keep this museum a viable force within the industry. I'd like to tell everyone that when I was born, Franklin Roosevelt was the President of the United States. World War II had just started, and my father enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. He didn't want to go into the Army, so he enlisted in the Navy. And after he came back from basic training, I was just a baby, so I had no knowledge. I only know what my mother told me. He then went off to the West Coast and went on a ship, and we did not see him again for 3 years. His ship was attacked by kamikaze pilots. He was wounded, but even when he was wounded, he saved someone's life, and he received a Purple Heart. He never spoke about it. It was only when I was a teenager and I was cleaning out some stuff, I found this purple bag, and in it was this beautiful award. And we had no one knew that he had a Purple Heart. It was just something that they didn't talk about in those days. He was a longshoreman. He worked with his body. He moved stuff from one place to another and loaded ships. And my mother worked in a hospital as a dietitian. She made the food for patients. There were 5 kids in my family, and we all worked from when we were very young. We did work at home. At home, we made brassieres. This is why I'm not excited by women's lingerie, because whenever I see a bra, the first thing I think is work. I am the oldest. My next brother is John. He worked in a supermarket and got to know people in distribution and ultimately became a vice president at Liggett and Myers in cigarettes. By the way, he smoked and I didn't. My brother, Richard, the third brother, became a telecommunications consultant. My brother Anthony went to work for Citibank before it was called Citibank. He just retired from there. And my sister became a nurse, and she ran the nursing department at Notre Dame. So from a very early age, we all had great responsibilities around the house. Whenever there was snow, we would go out with shovels to shovel people's driveways. Whenever there were leaves, we would rake them. And then I became a newsboy. Then I worked at the Brooklyn Eagle as a copy boy. But all during my younger years, I had jobs of various kinds. And so, yeah, we lived in the southern part of Brooklyn. I walked to grade school, PS 222, went to high school, James Madison High School. In my class, it was a very interesting high school, by the way. Bernie Sanders was in my class. Really? We graduated in '59 as well. He was the captain of the track team, and I was on the track team. I couldn't beat him at basketball, but I beat him at handball in many cases. Also in our class was Carole King. Actually, Carole Klein is her real name, the folk singer. Judy Blum, not Judy Blume, the author. Judy Blum, you know as Judge Judy. She was in our class. And so I'd have to say we were mostly overachievers in many cases. And it was a great group of people, and I had the greatest teachers. My English teacher wrote Superman comic books. in those days, teachers were not paid a lot of money, so they all had side jobs. And Mr. Coleman wrote Superman comic books, and in my senior year, I wrote a Superman comic book with him, which was interesting. I graduated high school in 1959, and I was the first person in my family to go to college. And that's because at that time, Brooklyn College was free if you maintained a B average. And I worked very hard at that. And I went to school at night. So it took me 6.5 years to get my degree, but I was very proud when I got my Bachelor of Arts degree. In high school, I went to my guidance counselor and I said, I need a job. He said, well, I know this company, Mergenthaler. I said, what do they do? He said, something to do with books. I said, well, that sounds interesting. So I started in the shipping department in Brooklyn, moved and was promoted to the mail room, delivered the mail, then was promoted to the order department, and I got to work on every desk, so I understood parts, matrices, international sales. Then there was an opening in the advertising department, and I really wanted that job. And I worked very hard, and I got an interview with the advertising manager, Mr. Coop, and I brought some of my college papers that I had written. And Mr. Coop said to me, well, I'd be taking a chance with you, but you know a little bit about writing, you know a little bit about the industry, I'm going to take that chance. And that was the greatest thing in my life. Mr. Coop gave me my chance. And so in the advertising department, I did every menial job, and I learned every other job, copywriting, insertion orders. I got to run the trade shows, do the public relations, every aspect, because it was a small department and you did everything. I got to know everyone in the company because we would be working with everyone. When I started, I delivered the mail to the president. When I left the company after 7 or 8 years, I was writing the president's speeches. I got to do my first trade show, and I delivered stuff to a trade show in New York City in 1959. It was the first time I was at a printing trade show. It was amazing. And then in '67, I got to go to Kansas City for a newspaper show, and that was fascinating. My oldest son, Richard, was born when I was at Linotype, and my younger son was born when I was at CompuGraphic. So they belong to the industry. Richard, as you know, works as an editor, and Robert is an artist and works, he worked for O'Reilly Books for 20-odd years. Now he works for a company called MathWorks. When I was 30 years old, I left CompuGraphic. I was on the trajectory to be a vice president, but I really wanted to be my own boss. So at the age of 30, I quit the company. And I started consulting and doing newsletters. And so every evening after dinner, we would go down into the basement and we would take the newsletters, put them into envelopes, address them, put them into bags so I could bring them to the post office. And so the kids were involved in what I did from the very beginning. They had no choice. Richard then, when he could start writing, helped me edit press releases. In fact, Richard likes to tell the joke that even in his 50s, he is still editing press releases, which is what he did when he was a teenager. Because then when I started Type World magazine, he helped me edit the press releases that we had. And Robert helped to do some of the artwork. In fact, Steve Jobs sent me a Macintosh in 1984. I kept it at home because there was great security around it. And so my son Robert actually did artwork with a program called FatBits, which was part of Mac Paint. And so that's how he got involved in art. And so he became an artist. He's an illustrator and now a videographer. So both of them really were involved in my life. And my wife ran a bookstore, which only sold murder mysteries, which I think was research on how to get rid of me.
Oh, you're kidding, right?
We loved that bookstore, by the way. When the kids graduated, the last son graduated high school, the question was, what was she going to do? And I said, what do you like doing? She says, I like reading murder mysteries. I said, oh, maybe there's a business there. So at that time, there were 3 bookstores in America, and I went to visit each one, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. And I got to visit them and where they got their books and what they did. They were very nice to me. And so we bought a building and we started Mystery Lovers, Inc., INK. And we only sold mysteries. And many mystery writers used to come in and give lectures and talks and sign books. And so I got to meet some of the great mystery writers of the 20th century, which is a fantastic thing. And again, the kids also worked in the bookstore, moving books around and everything. Again, my life really began with the linotype machine. That's where I learned the industry. That's where I made most of my friends in the industry. That was where my life started in terms of what I was going to do as a vocation. When the linotype ceased production in the late 70s, in the early 80s, they had been manufacturing this version of it, which is a more automated version of the linotype machine. It was called the Electron with a K. And Dow Jones wanted 3 more machines, and they had closed down the assembly line. So what they did was, then they were a very good customer, and Linotype wanted to keep them for photo typesetting later on. So they cobbled together enough spare parts from other locations and created these 3 machines. So this is one of the 3 last linotypes that was ever built. And by the way, when the guy who services our machines comes up here in a month or so, he's almost ready to get this thing working. So we may have it functional by the end of this year, if all goes well. So for instance, there are 10,000 parts in it, from little screws to big cams. And one of the people I worked for in the order department that handled parts was someone who had every part number memorized. And for many years, I would sit with the parts book and try to memorize the parts, but it never worked at all for me. I can remember a few of them at this stage of the game. In any case, just understanding what parts were needed for anything was very hard. Ottmar Mergenthaler was a clockmaker, and you can see a lot of clockmaking in the machine and the way it operates. The linotype machine was responsible for 90% of all the typesetting for newspapers in America. It all began because of the typewriter. When Christopher Latham Scholes invented the typewriter, he needed someone to test it. So the person he had tested was in Washington, D.C. His name was James Ogilvy Clephane. Clephane was a court reporter. He could take down material verbatim. The problem was he had to reproduce it for other people, the lawyers, the judges, etc. And the way he used to do that was to write on a lithostone and reproduce it with lithography. And so when he was testing the typewriter, he realized, because the ribbon had printer's ink on it, and the ink on the paper was still wet. You had to dry, they had drying racks. He said, well, if the ink is still wet, I can turn it over and press it onto the stone, and therefore I can reproduce from the stone. But the problem was the ink dried at different levels. So we had black letters and gray letters. So we went to someone to build a machine that would produce 1 line at a time, like a typewriter, but not a page. And he was having a problem with that machine. So he went to a machine shop in Washington, D.C., and he meets a German immigrant named Ottmar Mergenthaler. Talk about fate. And Mergenthaler helps him out with that. And he says, you're going down the wrong road. You need cast metal. That's how you're going to have to print. So Clephane puts together a group of newspapers to fund it. One of them is the founder of the Washington Post. And so they get the money, and Mergenthaler builds 2 prototypes. As you saw, the second one is here. And then finally in 1886, he has the final version, the blower linotype, and that becomes the first one that newspapers use to set type. And it revolutionizes the industry. So you have the typewriter keyboard and you have the linotype keyboard. And Clephane really is the one who was the catalyst to create the linotype machine as we know it. I have seen the changes where we were completely print-oriented to when we were television-oriented, now that we're electronically oriented. I mean, we all have these phones which feed us all kinds of news of every kind you can imagine in every way imaginable. And as I look into the future, I don't see a lot of print. Over time, we're going to be more electronically oriented. And the reason is, the people who appreciate print are my age. And we're dying off. And when we go, young people today are being raised on phones. My granddaughters have never known a time without the internet. They can't envision a world where we got our news from a newspaper. Yesterday, somebody gave me some old newspapers from the local area, and they gave me one recent newspaper, and it was only like 12 pages. And I'm saying, this is a shadow of what it used to be, because they only print that newspaper now 4 days a week. Everything else is electronic. And as time goes on, there will be less and less print. And if you want print, it will be printed for you on demand. As you know, over the years, in order to save money on paper, they have made newspapers narrower and narrower. My feeling is that within the next year, they will be at a size point where roll-fed inkjet can do them. If you want a printed newspaper, it will be printed on demand for you. Then the question is, how will it be delivered to you? Because they can't afford anymore to have news deliverers personally doing that. You're not going to get up in the morning and drive somewhere to get it. So a lot of the local newspapers deliver through the post office, but they don't come in the morning, they come all through the day. So the biggest problem is not going to be printing the newspaper, the problem is going to be distributing the newspaper. So over time, we're going to see more electronic. Now, there's an interesting statistic. In the United States, we lose a newspaper every 2 weeks. So when I was young, there were about 4,000 daily newspapers and about 8,000 weekly newspapers, 12,000 newspapers. Today, there's less than half of them, and that number continues to decline. In many cities, you had 5 or 6 newspapers. New York City, in 1923, had 26 daily newspapers, 13 evening and 13 morning. Today, there are 3. So my feeling is, and again, I hate to be a naysayer, but over time, if you look at all the trends, we're going to electronic distribution of news. By the way, printing is never going to go away. What will go away is certain kinds of printing. Again, financial documents. In many cases, they're all electronic right now. Operating manuals, they're all electronic right now. So I used to make a list of the 13 major categories of printing and all the products within it. And you can pretty well predict those that will go electronic. But certain things will never go electronic. Packaging will never go electronic until they figure out how to deliver a box of Wheaties over the internet. You're still going to need a box or a package of some sort. So package printing will still be there. There will also be other kinds of printing that will always be there. Utility printing, signage printing, leaflets of various kinds, coupons of various kinds. You have to look at every different kind of printed product and then predict what's going to happen with that printed product. So some will go away, but some will prosper and grow. Yeah, I got a call from RIT after I had sold my magazine, and I had nothing to do, and they said, would you like to teach for a year? They have something in academia called endowed chairs, where they invite people to come in and teach for a year or two, and then they leave and they bring other people in. And so there's a finite limit of how many years you can do it. And so when I got there, I decided to only teach courses on new technology. So I did the first courses on computer to plate, digital printing. By the way, the first courses on the internet. And as a result, my students got involved with me, and I started writing books about it, involving students as well. So because I was doing all this, they extended my contract to 2 years and then 3 years. But you cannot stay as a visiting professor for more than 3 years, or you get tenure by default. And no university will ever allow that to happen. So I then became tenure track, where the faculty votes on whether you should be a faculty member or not. And I was the only one that got a unanimous vote. And so I became a tenured professor. And so I started doing more of these special courses. In fact, I opened it up to weekend courses. I would do two weekends in a row for 2 credits on digital printing or publishing or whatever, because I got the companies to give us the equipment. So we had Docutext, we had digital printing, we had computer to plate. So we had all the technology for producing things. One of my courses, the students had to produce a book in 4 days. And again, they would start complaining about it, but then by the time the course was over, they loved the course. And they all wound up with something that they could take with them for the rest of their lives. So I think I started more new courses than anyone else in the history of RIT. And I was very proud of what I did there. And again, I worked with a lot of really great students who have gone on to great jobs within the industry, and I still stay in touch with them. What is important is what you accomplish in life. Can you point to the things you've accomplished? And I can point to several hundred students who I have helped to stay in this industry and to prosper in this industry. That's the important thing. I worked with Steve Jobs. He consulted with me on the font library for the first PostScript machine. He had other people as well, but I think I had more of an influence than most. John Warnock, I think I wrote the first obituary. I learned about it on a Sunday, and on Monday it was in whattheythink.com. I first met John when Adobe first started. He was a great friend, and he and Chuck Geschke, his partner, they really changed the industry, and yet most people did not know who he was. Oh yes, Effie Arazi. Again, I met him when Cytex started. He needed a font library, so he had me advise him on fonts. And he was a great guy. I loved when he came, we would exchange jokes. And because I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, I had a lot of the Yiddish jokes that we used to use. And then he founded EFI, of course. He's sort of an unsung hero because only a handful of us know what he accomplished. Benny Landa. Benny Landa created the Indigo, which was one of the first major color printing systems. It was a sheet-fed system. It was introduced at the same time as the Zycon machine, which at that time was being sold by AGFA. And that machine was invented by Lucien de Scampolliere. So those two people really revolutionized printing because they brought color into the equation. Before that, it was all black and white, and no one made a production machine that could do color. So they really had a big impact on the industry. And of course, Benny Landa is still at it with his nanographic printing. I think that the key invention of this industry was PostScript. PostScript changed everything about this industry. One, it changed the way fonts were handled. But then when they discovered that you could create something called PDF from PostScript, that changed everything again, because once you could create a file with all your high-resolution information in it, that file could drive a digital machine, it could drive a computer-to-plate machine, it could drive any kind of digital device. So you now had a way of encompassing all the information for printing in one kind of file. And you could even use it for electronic publishing. PDF was perhaps the second most important invention in the history of the printing industry. This is my world. We're in a city called Haverhill, Massachusetts. It's spelled Haverhill, like the spelling in England, but pronounced Haverhill for some strange reason. Nothing in Massachusetts is pronounced the way it looks. If it wasn't for the Indians and the British, nothing would have a name here. Haverhill, Massachusetts is just north of Boston, Massachusetts. It was a town with mills that made shoes, and we just happened to find a building here that met the needs of the museum. There were 14 of us that started the museum in 1978. It was called the Friends of the Museum of Printing, Incorporated. But I went off to teach at RIT for 20-odd years and was less involved. And when I came back, we started to really build the museum up more. And that's why we moved to this building and expanded everything we were doing. It hasn't been difficult for the collections because a lot of people have this equipment and didn't know what to do with it. They were going to scrap it. And so we gave them an alternative that we could save it. So our members have gone out and collected all of this stuff, moved it into warehouses, moved it into our old facility, and then moved it over here. Originally, our thought was to protect and save all of the old printing equipment, presses, typesetting machines, etc. But I expanded the concept into all the printed matter as well. In other words, all the publications, all the books about printing and typography and graphic arts, and all the collateral material and ephemera. So anything that related to printing in any way, shape, or form. Then we expanded into office equipment, typewriters and mimeograph machines, into computers because of desktop publishing, photo typesetting machines. So we've tried to encompass anything that was involved in graphic communication. Volunteers donate their time, and they are the greatest asset we have. We have about 20 volunteers who are here much of the time. They're here on Wednesdays and Saturdays. Everything I'm doing now is to give back to the industry everything I ever earned. I don't own a car. I don't own a house. Everything I have is devoted to this, and this is my goal. I need to raise the money, though, to keep it going. We have enough money to operate, but we need to hire people to run the place at some point in time. And that's what we need to raise money. Once we do that, then this will be a viable enterprise, and it will go on forever.